So far, we've discussed how we can measure or quantify the performance of different classifiers. We started off with accuracy, and we realized that it has certain assumptions and its limitations. And then we moved on to ROC curves, and we discussed how the ROC curve overcomes some of the limitations underlying accuracy, and but it has a set of limitations of its own. And then we moved on to precision recall curves, and we talked about how those can be useful for, especially for imbalanced data set, for imbalanced data set cases, right? The goal is we have a, if you think about it, what we've done so far in the module is we've talked about classifiers and we've talked about different metrics that can be used to analyze their performance, right? But and the way we've done that is we've set apart. So if you're given a training data set, you set apart a part of that training data set, which we call as the validation data set, and we use that to first of all evaluate how good or bad a particular classifier is doing, and then we can use the performance over that to tune the hyperparameters of that classifier. So if I see that a particular classifier is not doing well with a certain value of C or with a certain kernel, then what I can do is I can go ahead and change based on the performance analysis that I've done over the validation dataset. I can go ahead and change the type of the kernel, or I can even pick another classifier, right? So that's the basic thing that what we are doing, and it's called validation. And typically, the reason we are doing that is we don't have access to real world examples. So we have only a training data set and no test examples. So we use a part of the training data set to approximate, okay, or in more precise statistical terms, estimate the generalization performance of the classifier. And that makes this process an estimation problem in statistics with all its bells and whistles and problems associated with it. So let's say if you got a training data set of n is equal to, let's say, 1000 examples, and you use a part of that. So let's say you use 80% of that for training, and then you use 20% of that for testing. That's what we have done in the code that we just discussed. And we can use this bit as training, and then we can evaluate the performance over on this bit, right? On the part on the right. And that's going to give us a certain AUC, ROC, or an AUC PR, depending upon what metric you use. But you would get an estimate of how your classifier is performing on that particular test set. Now, what would happen if I change that test set? Let's say if instead of using this bit as the bit on the right as the test set, what if I use this bit at the left-hand side as the test set, and we use the rest of it for training? Is the performance going to change? Of course, because the data is different now, and it can probably give a different value of the same performance metric. So now we have got two estimates of the performance of a classifier. We can either go ahead and average those to get sort of like an expectation of how the classifier is going to behave in general as we change the data set, right? But can we do better? Or how can we make better estimations of the generalization performance of a classifier when we don't have access to real world data set? So that is the bigger problem in this picture. We have talked about performance metrics, we've talked about classifiers, but how should we design our experiments to get reliable estimates of the generalization performance? That's the question we're talking about right now, and that's what we're going to discuss in this particular video. So if there are some simple guidelines, some common sense guidelines, I call them, when you are designing experiments to estimate generalization performance of a classifier of any or any other machine learning model, is that there should be enough training examples left that you should be able to train. If you don't have enough training data, you will probably not be able to estimate the parameters of your classifier, so it cannot be trained very well. Okay, so you should have enough training examples left. But if you reduce, if you're given a set of a fixed data set of say n is equal to 1000 examples, and you use 990 of those for training, and then you're left with only 10 examples for testing, then probably your test estimates are not going to be reliable. Okay, so there should be enough training and test examples or validation examples left for you to be able to analyze the performance of your classifier. The next guideline is the test labels should not be used directly or indirectly during training. So whatever test set you have, whatever validation set you have, you're not to use those labels for training the classifier, okay? Or any other machine learning model, right? So this holds in general. So if you've got a test set, what I want you to think of is you don't even have it, you can't even look at it. Just use the training set, and to train the classifier, you can use the validation sets labels to evaluate or guess the performance or estimate the performance of your classifier. And then you can use, if you have access to another test set, you can use that to get a more reliable estimate, right? But what's more important is that you should always be clear about the application, intended use, and application of your system. And what that means, if you're developing a machine learning model, say for diagnostic purposes, you really need to understand what is the impact of type 1 and type 2 errors going to be. Is the dataset balanced? Should the dataset be balanced? Uh, it's not a good idea to go ahead and artificially balance a classifier test set, because if the real world problem, like for example, if you're trying to diagnose a coronavirus, which occurs or infects only a small percentage of the overall population, then we should we shouldn't be testing it on a balanced data set. We should be testing the classifier in the practical settings or in the real world settings, as they are called, and trying to estimate the performance of the classifier in those under those settings. So don't go ahead and try to balance those out, though it seems really tempting to do that. You should also be clear about the objectives of your performance evaluation. If your objective is to analyze the impact of hyperparameter settings on the classifier, then the only thing that you should change while evaluating the generalization performance are the hyperparameter settings of the classifier. So you test a classifier with one settings of the hyperparameter, then what you do is you go ahead and change those parameter settings and evaluate the performance over the same test set. And then you would get an idea of which of the two parameter settings is better. If your objective is to analyze features, then you should go ahead and try to analyze the impact of different types of features on the generalization performance. So it's important to be clear about what exactly do you want uh, out of your analysis. And it's always remember a good idea to re-emphasize that if your uh, experiment has been done carefully, and but the but the results don't follow or don't agree with your hypothesis, then your hypothesis is wrong. So you may have chosen a wrong setting of the of the hyperparameters of a given classifier. So it might be a good idea to go ahead and revisit that. Okay. So up till now, what we've talked about is what we want to do is to estimate the performance of the generalization performance of a classifier. Now, this is the primary issue with that. These are the statistical issues from estimation theory, that the variance of our estimate increases as the size of the test set decreases, and a small increase in the pessimistic bias when we decrease the size of the training data set. Okay, so those are the two primary issues, and I'm going to help you understand what these issues actually mean. And I'm going to take an example that has got nothing to do with machine learning. Let's say you've got a class of about 100, and let's make it 100 students, right? And let's say I want to analyze, or I want to identify what is the average height of those students. And of course, I can go ahead and calculate the average height for all of those students. And that's going to come out a number, a particular value, right? Let's say 5 feet, 5 inches, right? So that's the height we can calculate from this. But it doesn't really give me an idea of how much variation there is in the heights of what, but what I can do is I can calculate the standard deviation of the heights of these different individuals, right? Now, this is an estimation problem in which we are trying to estimate the average height and the variation of that height. So I'm going to call this sigma h, and I'm going to call this mu h. So this is the mean, and that is going to be the standard deviation. So that's how estimation theory works. If you've got a small sample size, that means if the numbers of students is small, the mean is going to be different. It can be different because the number of examples has changed and the standard deviation can be different. So the variance of these estimates can change as the size of the set that you're using to estimate this changes. Okay. So without going into much more statistical description, the problem that we have in terms of estimation of generalization performance of classifiers is that you've got a data set, okay, with a certain number of samples, let's say 100 samples. And what you are doing is you need to use a part of it for training. So this goes for training, and you have got the remaining part left for validation, as it is called, or in general, some people call it testing. So the goal of this test data set is that we want to use this test data set to estimate or compute some performance metrics. Let's say you want to calculate accuracy, if its assumptions are satisfied, and or if you want to calculate AUC ROC, you want to calculate precision, AUC PR, or average precision, any metric you want to calculate over this particular data set. So to get an idea of how good or bad your classifier is doing. Now, if you use a small data set for training, because the amount of data set used for training is small, probably the classifier is not going to be able to generalize over the validation set. So your results are going to be pessimistically biased. They're going to be lower because you haven't used enough training data. However, if you use too much of the training data, then you're only left with uh, a small test set or small validation set, and that is going to make your test estimates, because the number of samples in that is small, they are going to be they're not going to be that much reliable. What that essentially translates to is that if you've got a very small validation set over which you are computing these metrics, if I change the validation set to another set, the results can be vastly different. So the variance of the estimates can change when the amount of data that you're using for testing is small. However, we also have an effect when we have a smaller training data set, and that also impacts our performance. So I hope you're able to understand the issues that we are dealing with here. So what should we do? One way to analyze the performance of a given classifier is to use what is called cross-validation. And that's really simple to understand. In general, what we use is something called k-fold cross-validation. So let's say if you've got a training data set that has n samples in total, we first divide it randomly into k parts. Let's say if k is equal to 5, then you can divide them like such. This is going to be what is called fold 1, this is fold 2, this is fold 4, and this is fold 5. And then what you can do is at a given time, you can use 4 of these folds for training and the fifth fold for testing or computing the performance metrics. And then what you do is you can use a different training set. Let's say you can use these 4 folds for training, and then you can compute the performance of your classifier on the what is called the held out fold. So this is the basic algorithm for cross validation. And at the end of it, you're going to get as many performance metrics as there are folds, right? So you can get 5, in this case, performance metrics. So what we do is we divide the data set into k folds. We train on k minus 1 folds, leaving the kth fold out for validation or for computation of performance metrics. And then you can report the average and variation of those folds. But what happens, I want you to think about it, what happens when the value of k is small? What is the smallest value of k we can use? So you may want to pause that video. What is the smallest value and what is the largest value of k we can use? So think of that, and you may want to pause the video if you want to test your understanding. So the smallest value of k we can use k is equal to 2. So we can split the training data set smack in the middle. We can use one part for training. So we can use this part for training, and then we can use this part for validation. And then we can use this part for training, and we can use the other part for validation, right? So we get 2 estimates, right, of the performance metric that we have. Similarly, if we have, let's say k is equal to the highest value of k we can use is k is equal to n. In that case, this is called leave one sample out cross validation or leave one out cross validation. So in that, what you do is you calculate You train your data set on everything except for a single sample, right? And then you go ahead and test your classifier on that sample and you get its prediction. Now you cannot compute performance metrics on a single example. You can calculate accuracy, but you'll probably not get anywhere when calculating the AUC ROC and AUC PR. So typically what you do is to calculate the prediction score of that, you do the same experiment multiple times. You hold out another example, train it on the rest, and keep on doing it until we get decision function scores for all of the examples, and then you can go ahead and compute a single ROC curve. I want you to think about what is the impact of K going to be on the average performance and the variation in the estimated performance for different values of K. If you use a small value of K for a given classification problem, how is that going to impact the results, the average accuracies or average performance metric that we are going to calculate, and how is that going to change the variation of that for different values of K? Typically, uh, we use a larger value of K when the amount of data that we have for training is small. Okay. And we use a smaller value of K when the amount of data that we have for training and validation is large. So in the extreme example of that is if the amount of data is very small, you can use leave one out cross validation. And the question that I've asked you is, what will be the impact on approximated performance with increase in K for a given problem? So think of that, and we can have a discussion going on the module page for that. Okay. One more thing that is important, and sometimes people forget to do that, is stratification. It's really important when you have imbalanced data sets. So let's say if you got a data set in which you have got n is equal to, let's say, 1,000 examples, but out of these 800 are 800 examples are negative and only 200 examples are positive. Now it can happen that once you are selecting your data set for validation, uh, if you don't stratify, you may end up with a much larger proportion of positive examples in the test set in comparison to the training set. So that is going to be a problem. So if we make sure, or if we ensure that each fold contains the same number of examples as the overall data of a certain class, so if a class has 20% examples in the whole data set, then in all samples drawn from the data set or in all of the folds, each fold should have approximately 20% examples as well. So let's say if you got, in this case, the example that we are taking, we have a total of 1,000 examples, out of which 200 are positive and 800 are negative. That means 80% of examples that I should pick in a fold should belong to the negative class, and about 20% of those should belong to the positive class. So if we ensure that, then essentially what we are doing is stratification. So stratified cross-validation is a much better way of estimating cross-validation performance in comparison to non-stratified cross-validation. So when you are making your folds, make sure that you make them in a stratified manner. That is, the number of examples of a certain class should reflect the number of examples that are given to you, or the proportion of examples that are given to you in the overall training data set. So that's one of the things that you need to consider in cross validation. So one thing, as I've told you, that you can get different values of performance metrics when you change the value of k. So think of it like this. Let's say if you plot the value of AUC ROC for the same problem, but we change k, what is the relationship of AUC ROC for a given k? How is that going to change? What is the effect? But there is going to be differences. You are going to observe that there are going to be changes whenever you change the value of k. Now, this is not the k for nearest neighbor. This is the k for k-fold cross validation. So typically, we use a capital K to indicate this. Okay. So in general, there has been much research going on and on selecting the optimal value of k so you can get reliable estimates for your performance metric. And in this paper that is mentioned over here, they say that a tenfold cross validation is good. So if you got a sufficiently large data set, let's say if you got about 10,000 examples, or if you got about 5,000 examples, then you can probably do tenfold cross validation, and that's going to give you reliable estimates. Now, things or calculating accuracies of when you have a very large number of examples, or when you have a very small number of examples given to you as training, those are the tricky bits. That's where you need to use something else. If your number of examples is very large, then what that means is if I go ahead and try to do tenfold cross validation, it's going to take a very long time. So in those cases, typically what we do is we split the data set into what is called a training data set, and we've got a validation data set, and we divide it into the test data set. Typically, you can use 60% of the data for training, 20% for validation, and then 20% for the testing. So for a given classifier, let's say you choose an SVM and you choose a particular value of C, let's say C is equal to 100, and you choose an RBF kernel with the corresponding gamma value or the spread parameter to be zero point 0.1. Then what you do is you train your classifier that you have taken over here using this training data, and you calculate your validation performance for this particular classifier on this validation set. And let's say you get an AUC score of let's say zero point 0.8. So this is a made up example. Then what you can do is if you want to select the optimal settings of the hyperparameters, or if you want to select an optimal classifier, then you can go ahead and change the setting. Let's say what happens when I change C to 1000. Typically change one thing at a time. And you can go ahead and calculate the same value of the ROC, AUC ROC for the same value of the gamma parameter and the RBF kernel. And let's say that gives you AUC ROC of zero point 0.9. Now, because we have got a very large number of training examples available to us in total, and we have got a sufficiently large validation set, therefore these estimates are going to be probably statistically significant. So depending upon what is the actual number. So if your number of examples is very large, you can do a split like this. And once you have found the optimal classifier or the optimal setting of the hyperparameters, and you want to report the test performance of your classifier, then what you do is you pick that classifier that gives you optimal validation performance, and you can report the performance results over the test data set. And that's going to give you an idea of how or what to expect if you go ahead and deploy that model in practice. Okay, so this is what you can do if your number of examples is very large. This is called a training validation test split, but things get complicated when you've got a very small number of examples. Let's say if you've got only 100 examples that are available to you for training. And it's typically the case when the number of training examples can be small, where labeling is difficult. For example, if you're trying to get into biological or biomedical informatics, there the number of examples can be really small. So what you get is a very small number of negative examples because labeling is expensive. So a single experiment, for example, for protein structure determination, can easily cost about $100,000. So that's going to be a problem. So you get a very small number of examples. And there, the problem of estimating accuracy, because the sample size is really small, is even more difficult. So if you have got a small sample size, you can use leave one out cross validation. And there are some other strategies that we are not going to talk about in this module in detail, but they are available for you out there. And those are called bootstrap or bootstrapping strategies that you can use for this. And if you ever need to do that, look at what this means. What is the 0.632 or the 0.632 plus bootstrap, and how that can help you in evaluating the performance of your model when the number of examples is really small. Now, scikit-learn fortunately implements cross-validation. It implements stratified cross-validation, and it implements different types of bootstrap as well. So that makes our job really easy. And I'm going to show you, and if you want to take a look at the support for scikit-learn, for to do that, you are welcome to take a look at this link. We are also going to do that in our module through a notebook as a lab exercise. So let's say if you want to select optimal hyperparameters, let's say if you've got an RBF kernel, which is universal approximator for a support vector machine, then you want to calculate what is the optimal value of the gamma parameter and what is the optimal value of C. Then you can use what is called grid search, which is an exhaustive search through cross validation. So for a given value of gamma, we calculate, and a given value of C, we calculate over the validation data set what is its prediction performance, and we do it for all of that. And we can select what is the optimal performance by selecting at a given value of C and gamma, and then we use those hyperparameters along the in the deployment phase. Okay. So there are other approaches as well. There are some gradient-based methods. There are some evolutionary approaches that allow you to or help you get hyperparameters in a faster manner. These are some libraries that are available for you that allow you to do hyperparameter optimization over the validation data set really quickly. So you are welcome to explore that in your own time. Okay. There is another way. If the data set is very large, and if it takes a long time for you to compute the performance results for your classifier, and you're not able to do grid search, then for selecting of hyperparameters, let's say if you got a very large number of hyperparameters, then a, a useful strategy is to pick. You can do a random selection of different types of hyperparameters to see which hyperparameters give you the best performance. But one thing to make sure or ensure is that the choice of the hyperparameters is robust. And what that means is that if I change the hyperparameters up slightly, it doesn't change the performance of the classifier by a large amount. So let's say if we have got a classifier that only works or gives, let's say 0.95 AUC ROC, only when the C value is equal to 100 and the gamma value for the RBF is zero point 0.1. But if I go ahead and change this gamma value by, let's say, 0. From zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2, and the AUC ROC value drops from 0.95 to zero point 0.7, because this is a very large change, probably the classifier is not stable or it's not robust for these hyperparameter values. Typically, we want hyperparameter values that are robust, so they are stable. So please make sure that whatever hyperparameter values you pick, they are robust. So there is this particular part of the module that we have can be spanned into a module of its own. How can we evaluate and the generalization performance of classifiers? And which is of course not possible for us to do. But I hope with the lab assignments and with the assignments that you've been given, you'll be able to gain a better understanding. There's a plenty of reading you can do on this. So there's a really good chapter in this book, in the Introduction to Machine Learning book, which is called Design and Analysis of Machine Learning Experiments. I really welcome you to go ahead and read that. And then there are some really good papers that I want you to go if you have the time, but these are optional. So you don't have to go through these, but these are going to really help you understand these concepts in a bit more detail. So there's a paper on statistical comparison of classifiers over multiple data sets. So how can we find which classifiers generalize across a whole set of data sets? You're welcome to read this. If you want to analyze, if you want to understand statistical comparison, so this is an extension to the same to the paper above. You can you can use that. How can you choose hyperparameters for support vector machines? There is a paper on that. Please go ahead and try to read that. It is going to help you. There are methods that allow you to estimate the entire generalized or regularization path for a support vector machine as well. So if you want to do that, you're welcome to read that. These are really fun papers over here. So there is a paper published in 2014 that says, do we need hundreds of classifiers to solve real world classification problems? We've talked about 2 or 3 different classifiers, but out there are hundreds of different classifiers. And this paper begins the question, like, do we really need hundreds of classifiers, or are there classifiers like that we can always use and not worry about the choice of classifiers too much? And the conclusion of this paper was that, and this is going to be a spoiler alert here, and so if you want to read this and you wanted to read it with an open mind of your own and draw your own conclusions, you may want to skip the next few seconds of this video. So the conclusion of this paper is that uh, random forests is a classifier that we haven't talked about in this module as yet, but those are the only classifiers that you need, and they are going to generalize pretty well. Okay, and then there was a rebuttal to this paper that is also, I'm going to post a link to that. It actually says that they had the estimation strategies used in this paper are not robust enough, and we should not be able to say that random forests are the solution to everything, right? So please go ahead and read this paper as a sort of a case study in understanding how performance evaluation can be done for different classifiers. So this is a paper on learning from little, comparison of classifiers given little training, and learning with few examples. That's going to help you understand what to do when you've got a very small number of examples. What I'm going to do next is to talk about a case study by one of my students. Her name was Farzine. So she worked on predicting some, whether a particular protein sequence can form amyloids or not. So proteins are molecules in your body that actually do almost everything in your body. So if you've heard of insulin, that's a small protein that helps you regulate blood sugar and so on. And however, sometimes these proteins actually clump to each other to form what are called amyloids, and those are terrible. They give rise to different diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, cataracts, and so on. So what we were interested in is to identify whether a particular protein can form amyloids or not. So that's the problem that she was tackling. So the number of proteins that she had was, I don't remember the exact number, but it was sufficiently large. I'll be posting to a link to this paper as well. So you can go through the paper. But from a purely machine learning perspective, what's important is that we understand. The reason I'm giving this example is the way she did her performance analysis and selected hyperparameters. So she first started with a very simple classifier, and it's typically a good idea to start with a simple classifier. So she used a linear support vector machine, and then she did threefold cross validation, and then computed the average performance over average AUC ROC over different values of C. And she found that for the value of C is equal to 1, she gets an optimal, a slightly better performance in comparison to other values of C. And that's what she went ahead and used. She wanted to see if other classifiers, such as let's say a nonlinear support vector machine is able to do better. And to do that, she used an RBF kernel with different values of gamma, and she computed the average ROC value for different values of C. So this is grid search, and she found out the optimal value of gamma and C, which came out to be 0.76 in this case. She then went ahead and tried to analyze the performance of different types of classifiers for different types of features. So these are different feature representation for the same classifier with optimal settings of hyperparameters. And she found that one mer, which is a certain type of feature, you don't need to worry about what these features are. But she found using this ROC analysis is that this particular ROC, this particular feature gave the best performance. Okay, and she also did the same analysis with different types of kernels. So she used a radial basis function kernel, a polynomial kernel, and a linear kernel by plotting the ROC curves. And she found that one of these, which of these classifiers is actually optimal. And the reason I give that example is typically if you can't measure something, you won't be able to manage it. And we really need estimation theory to help us in understanding what is the optimal value of hyperparameters. How can I select what features are optimal, and how can I select the best classifier? But at the same time, it's also important to remember that if you tie in too strongly into a particular metric, you can lose the big picture. So some people, or in some researchers, can it's really easy to or it's really tempting to try to optimize for a certain metric, right? But it's always important to remember the problem that you're trying to solve, the real problem that you're trying to solve. If a classifier gives you 100% accuracy over a particular problem, then we need to make sure that that calculation of accuracy is experimentally sound, so that so that we wouldn't face any embarrassment when that classifier is going to be deployed in practice. There is a story, and I've never been able to verify this story, but it makes for a good talk about a particular military that wanted to design a machine learning system that that can be used to detect tanks. So let's say if we have got a picture of a tank, this is my poor drawing of a tank. You take a picture of that and you show it to a computer, and it tells you whether there's a tank in that picture or not. So to do that, what they did is they took pictures, they collected the training data set, they selected features, they gave the machine learning model the training data set and evaluated the performance, and they were very happy that the machine learning model was able to do very good, gave about 100% accuracy in detecting tanks. But when that machine learning model was deployed, it failed in practice. And when they started to analyze the reason for that, the reason came out to be that all the pictures with the tanks were taken on a cloudy day, whereas all pictures without tanks were taken on a sunny day. So instead of actually detecting tanks, it was the machine learning model was detecting whether it's sunny or not outside. So the moral of that story is that we really need to make sure that the performance assessment that we have done would generalize, and it's not due to some other effects that we have in our data set. Okay, so and it's always a good idea to hold out a test set and not touch it until you're satisfied with the validation you have done, you selected an optimal classifier, then you go ahead and test it on that so that you are able to make sure that the classifier or the machine learning model that you have developed is going to generalize out in the real world. So I hope you're able to understand various concepts. We started our discussion about experiment design in machine learning and how this makes it the experiment design in this makes this data science because we're analyzing using experiment design strategies or the scientific method to analyze data and to pick what optimal parameters of a classifier we should pick. And we talked about how we can measure accuracy. We've also talked about that there are limitations associated with each and every performance metric that we use. And it's important to understand those limitations and understand the assumptions and only use a performance metric if it makes sense or it's usable under those for a given problem. We've also talked about how we can estimate the performance of a classifier by measuring its prediction performance using cross validation, and what is the impact of the value of the number of folds. We've briefly discussed that as well, and how we can ensure that we get reliable estimates. So I hope you are now in good shape to work on your assignments and apply these concepts in practice. Thank you.